getting to see another one of our festival authors. I'm going to give it just another minute or two, or Angela, do you think we're ready?
I'm admitting people right this second.
Okay, so we'll wait another couple minutes just to make sure everyone is here. But it's good to have you all with us, and we'll get started here in a minute.
All right, and I went ahead and hit record, so we're good whenever everybody wants. And you can, again, type in the chat your questions if you'd like our guest author to answer them later on.
So welcome all, the 43rd Annual English Festival. This is afternoon on Thursday. Kind of have to remind ourselves that since we're virtual. I'm Jeff Buchanan, co-chair of the festival. I'm going to just take just a second of your time, and then we'll get to festival author. My colleague, Dr. Gary Salvner, will introduce her to you. I just want to say one thing, because I've said it a few times of this festival, kind of as an apology that, you know, we're doing the best we can because we're virtual, you know, but I want to acknowledge that the fact that we're virtual is making it possible that you see Bridget Heos today. Ordinarily, we wouldn't be able to bring as many festival authors to you. And so this is one of the perks, I guess, of a virtual festival. So to introduce Bridget to you, Dr. Gary Salvner.
Hello, everybody. I'm Gary Salvner, co-chair of the English Festival Committee, and I also welcome you to this session. It's my delight to introduce this author. Bridget Heos grew up in a family of storytellers, and her parents encouraged her creative efforts, letting her, for example, put on big play productions in their backyard. In one way or another, she's been writing ever since. She is the author of more than 100 books for young people, nearly all of them nonfiction. Of course, we know her as the author of Blood, Bullets, and Bones, that wonderful book that School Library Journal called a gruesome yet highly entertaining and fact-backed history of forensics. A fun fact, Bridget's favorite food is chips and guacamole. Another fun fact, she has another 4 books coming out just this year. A note before Bridget begins, we expect to have time for questions at the end. While she is speaking, feel free to send questions through the chat function, and my colleague Stacy Graber will review them and ask as many as possible in our remaining time. Bridget Heos, welcome to the YSU English Festival as one of our 2021 James Houck lecturers. We look forward to your visit with us.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thank you to everyone who read Blood, Bullets, and Bones. I'll tell you a little bit about the process of making that book and some of the things that surprised me as I was making it. And I'll be sharing my screen and some slides with you so that you can get a look behind the scenes of Blood, Bullets, and Bones. So I'll start, I saw someone already asked this in the chat. I'll start by how I came to write this book. I'm sorry, I'm just going to try to do a full screen here. Not sure if I'll be able to. So I've been writing nonfiction books for a long time. I've written more than 100 nonfiction books on a variety of topics. When I started writing nonfiction, it was all, they would give me assignments. So I would write things like biographies, and I got to write about WWE wrestlers and Lady Gaga. You can see some of them there. And from there, I started writing stories that were my own idea. But I will say this book, Blood, Bullets, and Bones, was the idea of the editor. And the editor, her daughter was on a high school forensic science team where they competed to solve pretend murder cases. and whoever solved it first won the prize. And I thought that was amazing. You know, where I went to school, we did not have that. It would be more like I could play basketball or soccer would have been the choices. So I thought that was so interesting. And she said that she thought it'd be good to have a history of forensic science and how all the science came about. And I love that idea because I'm a big mystery fan. Of course, I read more fictional mysteries, but it was interesting to me as I wrote, I got the feeling that mystery writers probably read a lot of the same books that I was reading for research. So the research entailed, a big part of it was memoirs that forensic scientists had written. Many medical examiners have written memoirs of their time doing autopsies, you know, in the case of a murder investigation. And one that you see there by Milton Halpern, that is by a medical examiner from 100 years ago. And so I was able to read about all these older cases from their perspective. Then there were some books along the same lines, but written by like a journalist, true crime books. I was able to get my hands on some medical examiner textbooks. And then with the internet, it was fairly easy to access old newspaper articles that chronicled ongoing investigations. I did land one interview with an investigator. His job, he had a very interesting job in Fulton County in Atlanta, where he opened up cold cases based on them having DNA. And they had saved the DNA, not really knowing about DNA yet, but knowing that it may be helpful at some point. And so he was able to go and interview people whose DNA matched based on, they were usually in prison for another crime. So they already had some DNA evidence on them. And he was able to go talk to them and solve these cold cases. And a lot of times they were murders of women who didn't have anyone in their life. They were just outcasts of society. And the investigator said it was just such a good feeling to be that person to advocate for them. And even though, you know, unfortunately they were already passed away, he was able to do justice for them and get those people out of a situation where they could do the same harm again. And then I would use court transcripts and death certificates. But it's important to know that any of these sources can be wrong. And it's not usually because they're trying to be wrong or they're trying to lie, but they just may not have all of the information. And so you have to keep looking, keep searching. And one case from the book where this was especially true was the case of Cora Crippen. So if you remember from the book, Cora Crippen was living in London with her husband, Holly Crippen, but they were both originally from America. And Cora was very popular. She was part of a ladies' theater group, and her friends loved her. And then she went missing. And so her friends started sort of investigating themselves, because when they asked Holly where she was, he said that she'd gone to America to care for a sick relative. And they didn't believe that because they thought she would have told them if she was leaving. And so they went to the police and said, we think something is amiss and we think Holly Crippen actually killed Cora. And so the police came to the door and interrogated him, and he fled the country with his friend Ethel Lenev, who was dressed as his son. So they're fleeing the country, she's in disguise, and he did look guilty. And then the police went to his house and searched it and said that they found a body that matched Cora's based on it having a scar that she would have had. And so they brought him back and he stood trial. And I was able to read the trial on the Old Bailey, which is the British courts. And you can, it's really fascinating. You can read court cases that date back to the witch trials that they had in England on the Old Bailey website. And so I was able to read the court transcript, and I was able to find pictures of her friends during the trial. And you can see them talking, and you can just imagine them saying, oh, he's so he's so guilty. I can't wait till he's brought to justice. And so originally that's how I wrote this part of the book, that he was found guilty, and that, you know, the evidence pointed to that. And so it seemed like a fair verdict. But I went through the book at the end knowing that sources can be wrong because they don't have all the information at the time. And I was just double checking everything. I thought mostly I would come across new information about some of the newer cases, but I decided to just check all of them before it was going to go to print. And this case did have new evidence, which was that a scientist knew that they still had the tissue from the body that was said to be found in Holly and Cora's basement. And so he knew that that tissue might have DNA, and he could actually test it and make sure that it was Cora's. And he was able to do that based on her family. He took DNA from her family, and so they were able to look and see if it was a family match, and it wasn't a family match. And not only that, but the body wasn't even a woman's body, it was a man's body. So they knew that obviously couldn't have been her body. And so sadly, Holly Crippen may not have killed her. And in fact, the same scientist just did some gumshoe detective work and looked at the old phone books in New York and found a Cora Crippen living in New York. Now that could have been anyone, but it could have been actually Cora Crippen, and it could have been that she really did go to America. So I was glad that I found that new information, because you don't want to ever suggest that someone was guilty when there's evidence that they may not have been. So after doing the research, or I should say while I'm doing the research, because that's so ongoing in a way, I start writing. And it made sense for this book to go in chronological order because it's a bit of a history book, and the science developed in that way. I have to say I was surprised by the order that forensic science developed. I had assumed that the idea of a detective or the idea of investigating a crime would have been something that was always done. You know, it would have just been common sense that if someone was murdered, you would investigate it step by step. But it really wasn't. There wasn't this idea of investigating crimes until like the late in Europe and America, like around the 1800s. Now it was happening in China, in ancient China, they were investigating cases. And so they were much more advanced. And the investigations often did involve the medical examiner. So there's an actual diagram of instructions for how to do an autopsy that dates back to about 2,000 years. And so they were solving crimes, but meanwhile in Europe, and then as an extension, America, because they kind of followed that same pattern when they moved on to America, their idea was if they saw a crime, they would punish it harshly, and that was supposed to deter crimes. But it didn't work, because here you see, this is an engraving of someone had stolen and they were being punished by death. And this is at the hanging, and there's a picture of a pickpocketer. So pickpocketing was rampant at these death penalties, and it was just the idea that, well, I might be able to get away with it. Meanwhile, people were doing, there you can see the pickpocketer circle, but meanwhile, people were getting away with murder while people were being put to death for small crimes. Here you have Marian Cotton, and maybe you remember her from the book. She looks rather unassuming, but she was, of course, a serial killer, and her weapon was poison. So they were able to determine that based on something she said. One thing that happened is she had about 20 people that she was close to die, and often in her care. But that wasn't enough to aroused suspicion based on the fact that in those days, a lot of people did die. You know, they didn't have vaccinations. They didn't always have clean water or hygiene. And so a lot of people got sick and would die from things like typhoid, which you see in the original medical certificate. But she said something strange, which is what made them re-examine this case. She brought a boy that was living in her care because his father had died to a town official and said, could he go to the workhouse because I don't want to take care of him anymore. And the workhouses were like a last resort. If kids lived at the workhouse, they were just dangerous places. They had to work hard and they didn't get good nutrition and they were crowded. And it was actually a very dangerous place for children to live. And so the official said, well, if your child goes, you will have to also go. And she said, well, he'll be gone soon enough. And so they exhumed the body and re-examined it for poison. And so, as you can see, they were capable of testing for poison. They just didn't do it routinely. And so if someone said, oh, you know, this poor woman that I was taking care of died of, she got sick and she died, they would just take their word for it. And as some of these cases were brought to light, they realized that people were using everyday sickness to get away with murder by poison. They wrote a poem about Mary that is a bit morbid. It was kind of a nursery rhyme, which is, it's kind of strange that it was a nursery rhyme. But they decided to have the coroners do more routine autopsies. So the idea came about from Thomas Wakely, who was the editor of a medical journal called The Lancet, which is still around today. You could go on the Lancet website and read about different diseases and innovations in medicine. And he advocated for there to be a medical examiner that examined all cases where the cause of death was not known. And that's still what's done today. You know, if you know that someone went to the hospital and they were diagnosed with a certain form of cancer, for instance, and then they died of that, that would be a known cause of death. But if nobody was really sure why they died, they would do an autopsy because there may be, usually it would be more to see what happened and maybe there's a disease that needs to be addressed within the family. But it, of course, also did catch lots of murders. With the medical examiner, they sort of became celebrities in a way. And one famous medical examiner was Bernard Spilsbury, who had a case of the brides in the bath. So this was the case where several women died in a bathtub. And in those days, you know, you didn't have the news didn't necessarily report as widely as it does today. So it ended up that they would report that a bride died in a bathtub, you know, to the west of England, and then they reported that it happened in the east of England, and people wouldn't see that it had happened twice, but somebody did see it. They saw both newspapers and they sent it to an investigator. And it was determined that the same man was married to both women. So it became a situation of what are the chances that a man would have two wives die in a bathtub? And that argument is still used today. So there is a recent case that my dad is a lawyer, and he sent me a case where it was a man who had one wife drowned, and then two wives went missing, never to be heard from again. And he said they both had wanted a new start. And they used the argument, what are the chances that two of your wives would go missing because they wanted a fresh start, you know, from their families and everything, and that another wife would also drown. And so that argument is still used today. Now, Bernard Spilsbury was famous, but he was the medical examiner in the case that I told you about, that the body was found in the basement, but it turned out like it wasn't a match for Cora Crippen. So he does retrospectively have a reputation of sometimes playing a little fast and loose with the evidence. That was in England. In America, the first medical examiners happened a little later than in England. And in New York, they actually didn't come about until around 1920. And then they started going out and investigating every mysterious death. And that did put an end to the scourge of poisonings that was happening. It's kind of hard to believe, but in those days, poison was a bigger cause of death than like accidents and gunshot wounds. And it was pretty rampant. And it's just hard to believe because nowadays you would only really hear about poisonings associated with political assassination attempts. So next came the detective, and that's what really surprised me because I would have thought detectives came first. It can be a low-tech form of investigating, but it wasn't, and there were just a lot of deaths that went unsolved until the introduction of the detective. People were skeptical of detectives at first because they thought they were going to spy on them. But as they solved some cases that the public was angry about, they became the heroes that they're often still portrayed as today in books and movies that are detective stories. And so one of those cases that they solved was Britain's first train murder. And a man was thrown out of the train and unfortunately died. And it was all to steal his pocket watch, which became evidence. They were looking for that pocket watch that was pawned at a jewelry shop owned by John Death, which was just kind of a coincidence. And then they also had the hat of the killer because he had switched hats with the man. And so it's just very old-fashioned detective work that brought this case to light and popularized the idea of the detective. So if you want to read more about detectives, there's a book. This is a short sort of picture book biography of Kate Warren, America's first female detective. And it also talks about the Pinkerton Detective Agency in America. So that's just, and there she is. That's her picture in the book. And then she's the one holding on to the tent pole in the picture. With the detective came the need for the crime lab so that they could investigate the items gathered by the detectives. And this was actually based on Sherlock Holmes. He was always in the stories investigating evidence like footprints. And I remember in one story, he said that he was able to determine from ashes what kind of cigar was smoked. A lot of this stuff actually wasn't true. You know, there was sort of an overestimation of how much some of this evidence could tell them. For instance, if you have the idea was like a tire, for instance, each tire is so unique that you can tell one tire from another tire, even if they're the same make and model of tire. And I mean, that may be true to some extent, but not enough that you would be able to see it or analyze it. And so there were cases where this was overestimated, and instead of saying what was true, which was that this was made by such and such type of tire, it would be said this was made by the tire driven by our suspect, the tire of the car driven by our suspect. And that just was overstating things. And so that's something that that judges, of course, don't want investigators to do. One thing left behind on crime scenes are fingerprints. And the idea of fingerprinting really became popular around 1900. And at first, it was really a boon for investigators because the criminals didn't know that they could read their fingerprints. But it became known pretty fast. And so they started either wearing gloves or wiping things down. But even as late as the 1950s, it was used to solve crimes based on the fact that mistakes are made. So with the Great Train Robbery in England, the men robbed a train and then they made their getaway in the country. That's the country home there. and they passed their time playing Monopoly. So they did wipe down the surfaces. They knew about fingerprints, but they forgot to wipe down the board. They only wiped down the box. And so that's how they were caught. And they were in prison until fairly recently. Of course, another thing left behind at crime scenes are bullets. And probably the most famous case for that was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This was by Al Capone. He was probably the leading gangster of the time, based on the fact that he was able to run alcohol with no regulations because it was illegal. And his rival was Bugs Moran, who decided to steal from Al Capone. And so as revenge, Al Capone sent his men to kill some of Bugs Moran's men. And they made it look like they were the police. And that was really just so that the gangsters would be caught off guard. You know, they would have been armed. And but the public thought for a while that it was the police, and they were angry because of, you know, that's not how you do justice. And so the police had to try to prove that the bullets left behind were not from police guns, they were from gangsters' guns. But again, bullets are one of those things that it's now said that you can't tell from a bullet which specific gun it came from. Only the make and model of the gun would be more accurate. And the final part of evidence, DNA evidence, this is the gold standard. It was interesting to me to learn that this was really the only forensic science, or the first forensic science, that was published first in a peer-reviewed journal. So scientists have to publish their ideas, they have to have it peer-reviewed by other scientists so it can be determined if this is good science. And DNA had already been vetted like that, not for use in murder investigations, but just because obviously DNA was like the biggest discovery of maybe ever. And so they knew it was good science before they ever used it to solve a crime. And this was a case where it was a very sad case, and I did try to avoid in the book cases that involved young people. But this one did, and it was such a groundbreaking case that I had to include it. So it was 2 teenage girls that were murdered at different times. There were a few years in between, and they had a suspect that had the suspect's father didn't think that he had done it. He thought it was a misunderstanding. And so he heard about DNA evidence, and, you know, his attorney advised him, if you really think he's innocent, this could prove it, but if he's guilty, it will also prove that he's guilty. And he said, you know, I really think he's innocent. And so they tested the DNA, and it wasn't his. And so it's really incredible. They were going to test the DNA of all the men in the surrounding areas. And this was going to take years based on DNA being new, and it was slow to test. But they got a break in the form of old-fashioned gossip at this pub. Some coworkers had gathered at the pub, and one of them said, you know, he said, I ended up having to give my DNA to another guy because he had already had to give his DNA to someone else. And his coworkers were like, what? What? That doesn't make sense. And they went to the police, and it turned out the man who had asked for his DNA was convicted of these murders. But DNA has also led to exonerations, and it's led to showing how people can be wrongfully convicted. You see in this chart, they did a study of cases where DNA had shown that the person in prison wasn't the killer. Their DNA didn't match. And eyewitness misidentification was the main culprit in 72% of cases. Sadly, unvalidated or improper forensic science was the problem in 154 cases. So that's all this forensic science we've been talking about can be used. Like I said, it can be overstated, or it can just, in some cases, be sort of junk science. And that is the case they found with bite mark science. With bite mark science, it actually dates to, speaking of witch trials, the Salem witch trials, where there was a case that some of the girls said they'd been bitten by the reverend in town. And so they just kind of eyeballed it and looked at their bite marks, and then looked at his mouth and said it was a match, you know. And we know now that the Salem witch trials, sometimes they're referred to like in Halloween stories, but it really was a national tragedy. And there's a monument in Salem for the victims of this hysteria. Well, sadly, they continued to use that science until fairly recently, where it was just looking at the bite mark and then looking at the person's mouth. And there was even a case where there was a sandwich left at the crime scene, and the bite mark was used to match the suspect. But the suspect's lawyers found out that in the autopsy that the sandwich was found in the stomach of the victim. So it wasn't even the suspect's bite mark that they were examining, it was the victim. And a more recent case that used bite mark evidence was the case of Roy Brown. There was bite mark left on the crime scene, and it was linked to him. And he had been in jail in the past, and so they chose him to go on trial for a murder. And he started researching in prison. He was convicted, and he started researching in prison and learned that they had DNA evidence associated with that bite mark. And he also found out that there was another suspect in the course of the investigation that was actually that knew the victim. He was brothers with her, I think, boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. And so he got the idea, Roy Brown, that they could look at the DNA and see if it matched Barry Bench. And so he sent this note to Barry Bench, and he said, judges can be fooled and juries make mistakes, but when it comes to DNA testing, there's no mistakes. DNA is God's creation, and God makes no mistakes. Well, when this was received by Barry Bench, he ended up jumping in front of a train. And so they were able to match the DNA to the daughter instead. And that got Roy Brown freed from prison. So with DNA, they have been able to determine some forensic science was not very scientific in the first place, and they wouldn't use it today. And also just not to overstate, you know, if you find a hair, unless you have DNA attached like in a root, you can really only say, well, the suspect has blonde hair. You can't say, this is the suspect, this is her exact hair. And so they're more careful about that today. And I did wonder, you know, in the book, I wrote it as with the information I know, but it's possible that some of the cases in the book were wrong, you know, and that they may have overstated like the hair evidence, and it may have been someone else. It's one of those things where we may never know, or maybe we'll find out, like with the case of Cora Crippen. I have to say, writing the book was hard because it was just so sad, all the lives lost and the lives affected, you know, the families that remained. So one thing I would think about, not to be cheesy, but, you know, I write books for little kids too, is to look for the helpers, and just to think about, you know, when I talked to the detective who did the cold cases, he really cared about those victims. And to know that there are people out there that just want to do justice and help people and set things right is what would make the book, you know, more.
So you really got to So you really got to meet the person, the detective, like
Yes,
face to face?
I got to speak. I talked to him on the phone. So it was lucky because a lot of people, you know, a lot of people don't want to talk to you just because it's kind of that old adage, if you stay quiet, you don't get in trouble. And then if you speak, you may. But he was friends with my sister-in-law, so he agreed to talk to me. So yeah, it was interesting to talk to him, and I guess heartening to hear his story and all the help that he was able to do. And good that they kept the evidence, the DNA evidence, with hope that there would be a science that would make it useful at some point. And then it did. And the other thing I would think about is, this is a quote I like, "The truth isn't always beauty, but the hunger for it is." And obviously a lot of these cases have very sad outcomes, but it was important that that the truth be known in all the cases. So, and maybe it will inspire kids to get involved in the justice system in some way, or involved in science. And so I think now we could do some questions. And I'm going to do, I'll just come back on the screen for questions.
All right. How did you choose what to include in the book, like the specific cases?
Good question. So I wanted examples for each type of forensic science. And I tried to do cases, well, if there was a groundbreaking case, like the DNA case, I would include that. Otherwise, I would try to choose cases that were interesting. And I would try to, like I said, I would try to have the cases be involving like adults. And I would try to do some like different regions, you know, of the country when we moved into America. I wouldn't do there were some cases that were just too big to do. Like I started writing about the Kennedy assassination, but it was just, that's just such a big case, and there are books unto it, you know, there are books just about that, and I decided not to include it, even though that was obviously a huge firearm analysis case.
Next question. Were you ever particularly upset or surprised by one of the murders that you had to research for the book?
Yes, I thought the ones, yeah, I thought they were, well, they're all upsetting, but the ones where there's, you know, sometimes there would be a motive, like the motive would be money or something like that. And I guess those were a little easier to write about than when there was just no motive. The person was just like a killer, and it's just hard to understand that for me more so than the others. Yeah, why they would do that. And then I'll say the one, it was harder to write the newer cases because I would think about, this person should still be alive and their families should still be together. And versus the older cases, you know, by now they would have already passed away, even if that hadn't happened. And their families that knew them would have passed away also. So I think it was kind of like once we got out of the black and white pictures and into the color ones, that's where I just thought it got really depressing. And that's when I started really looking to the helpers in the story.
Thank you. Why is there such fascination with this blood and gore stuff? How long did it take you to make this book, and where did the idea for a book on forensic science come from?
Well, the idea came from the editor, because her daughter is interested in this. I think, well, for me, what I like about fictional mysteries is the puzzle, and the idea that you can take these different clues and solve and set things, can't undo the crime, but set things right because you figured it out, and now that won't happen again by that person. And then I tried to choose less violent cases. You know, I didn't want it to be the book, because I knew the book was for your guys' ages. I just didn't want it to be any scarier or sadder than it needed to be, knowing that it was already going to be very sad. And so I did try to not write so much about the violence, but keep that focus more on the puzzle and the way that it was solved.
Related to that last question, what is your favorite case that you researched, the most meaningful?
I thought I thought the train one was interesting, the first train murder, because detectives were new, and it showed that this simple idea of gathering evidence and following the tracks and retracing steps worked. And you think just because an idea is simple, everybody should have known it all along, but that's not true. Like even the wheel had to be invented, you know, and it wasn't invented in everywhere in the world. Farming had to be invented. Like all these things that you just would think we'd all be born knowing weren't. And so I like that case because it showed this simple idea works and it will help solve crimes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for writing this book. I'm writing a paranormal mystery novel, and this book gave me so many ideas. What is your favorite book and genre?
Well, my favorite thing to read is mysteries. I tend to gravitate toward British mysteries. Like I really like the author P.D. James and Agatha Christie. I like a paranormal mystery. I've read some of them, but yeah, I got the same impression too, that in reading this book, that's how mystery writers must get their ideas, is from real crimes. And, you know, you can take one of the cases in the book and move it to your paranormal world that you're creating, and it changes everything. So I'm glad to hear that it's useful to you. I know writing a mystery is hard. It must be hard because you're writing and you're making a puzzle. So I hope you have good luck with your book.
Excellent. What is your biggest struggle or challenge writing? And related to that, how do you research and find evidence?
So for research, I start general and then go more specific. So I would start with books. And then once I read about a case in a book, I try to find out more about it, like in newspapers, read articles, and maybe even find some documents or trial transcripts. And then the hardest part of writing, well, with nonfiction, the research is the hardest part of writing, and you try to get it all right, but you know, like I said, the sources you use may not be completely have all the information either. And so you've got to really make sure you have all the information. And, you know, that you have to really try to get everything right. And so I'm always worried, oh, I'm going to like make a mistake. And then once I hear about the mistake, I'll be like, oh, how did I miss that? So it's a little stressful in terms of that.
How long did it take you to write this book?
This book took about 2 years altogether, between the research and writing. And I also researched the photos for this one, that was actually a little easier than I thought. There were a lot of photos associated with the cases, and I have a small photo budget to buy the photos. And a lot of them are just on the different photo websites. And I'm always working on more than one thing. So if I'm working on this book, I'd also be working on like maybe a picture book or a shorter book.
Excellent. Did you have a favorite type of crime that you researched and learned about?
I think I like, and I think this is why I like reading British mysteries. I like a crime where they're just trying to get the person's money. Call me old-fashioned. It's a terrible thing to do, but it just seems less scary than, you know, a crime of anger or just no reason at all. And so I think those, it's still terrible and very strange, but you can see what their goal was at least.
Thank you. Have you always been interested in detective work and things like that, or did you become more interested in it when writing this book?
I think I was always interested. I still read, I'll read cases that come up in the news, that usually if they're reported nationally or internationally, there's some twist or some, like the case my dad sent me, that they're using this really old argument of what are the chances. I think, honestly, I became less interested because it was just the gravity of all these cases just set in. And so then when I would watch even fictional mysteries on TV, for the one hand, I was able to solve them because I'd written this book. And so I'd be like, I know who did it early on. I remember my mom, when we were watching mysteries, she always knew who did it. And so I knew who did it, and then just like the gravity of it, I kind of actually took a step away from mysteries for a while after writing this book. I needed a little break, but now I'm back to reading them.
Related to that, which movies or TV programs or series do you think complements your book particularly well?
I'd say the cases I chose would tend to have, it depends on which part of the book it was. One show that may be kind of similar is Small Town Murders, because a lot of times they'll select cases that have a unique bit of evidence that came to light. And I think that show also does a good job showing how it changed the town and changed the people's lives after it happened. And so that would be one. I don't watch many of the true crime. I like the lighter mysteries like Psych and Monk. And I'd say some of the cases, they maybe would use like the strange little bit of evidence that I would read about. So in that way, it would maybe be similar, but those it's hard to believe you can create like a lighthearted mystery. I mean, it's almost kind of, sometimes I'm like, should I really be watching this? But they are so entertaining, so I can't help but watch those mysteries.
Thank you. In your opinion, what was the hardest case to put into this book?
Well, probably the DNA one, because it did involve young people. And then the other one that, like the Jack the Ripper case, was hard because it was never solved, so and it was just that it was so gruesome, and even though it happened a long time ago, I guess maybe because of the fact it was never solved, it just feels almost like an ongoing case. So that one was really hard also. And there's so much evidence and so much writing about that one that it takes a lot of research too, just to see what's actually known about that case.
The next question relates to the one of the TV series that you mentioned previously. Do you have a favorite character from Psych?
Well, I like the partners the best, Gus and, what's the main guy's name? Well, I like the two detectives, Sean. Now, my nieces and nephews like Jules the best, and they actually named their daughter, they named their puppy Jules because they love Jules so much on that show.
Excellent. What was the scariest crime you ever researched?
The chapter that was scariest was the one about the criminal minds, the trying to get at the person out, the motives. I can't think of the name of that chapter now, but it involved like serial killers, and where they tried to profile the criminal profiling. That was the scariest chapter, because a lot of those, that's kind of a new idea, and so a lot of the cases were newer. And when they do that type of profiling, it's usually a very dangerous person that they're trying to get a hold of. And but they did solve a lot of those cases, so it shows that that it seems like it works. So that was the good news of that chapter.
Also related to that question about profiling, what is the most famous story of a criminal profile or profiler?
Well, the case, I think I put it in the book. There was a detective. She was a woman detective, a profiler, and they based the Silence of the Lambs book on her. They based Clarice on her. So her cases, I would say, are famous. I'm not sure what would be. Honestly, they've tracked down and put away several serial killers, and those are all famous cases. Because, what a relief to get those people off the streets.
Also related to serial killers, did you research the Zodiac killer?
No, I didn't research that one. It must not have come up. In my early research was kind of to determine which cases to use, and it must not have come up in that case. But and I don't like reading or writing about serial killers. I kind of had to do it just because that was part of the criminal profiling. So, but the fewer cases I could investigate, the better, as far as I was concerned on that. So even with the criminal profiling, I did try to choose cases that weren't necessarily related to serial killers. And that's just because I find them to be scary. And like, if there's an episode of Law and Order that involves a serial killer, I don't watch that one.
Thank you. What made you want to become a writer?
Well, my family was always telling stories, as Dr. Sovner said. And so I wanted to tell stories too, but I was shy when I was younger. And so I didn't want to like make them up as I went along or tell them out loud. I wanted to write them down. So I think that was my start.
Excellent. Which detective from literature is your favorite? Poe's Dupin, Conan Doyle's Holmes, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, Poirot?
Mine would be Miss Marple. I think it's hilarious how she uses her gardening as a guise to snoop on all her neighbors. And I think she's obviously brilliant. And so, yeah, she would be my favorite. And I love the British mysteries, so.
What was the oldest case you looked into?
Well, the case from ancient China, and I didn't have a lot of details about it, but the case where the medical examiner did the test where the body was found in the fire and did the test with the 2 pigs to see if they put in the fire, if they would have ashes in their mouth. That would have been the oldest. And then after that, I think it was the Jack the Ripper case, because that was sort of to show what happened before there was very much of this forensic science available. And obviously that case today would be solved by forensic science. So that was kind of the point of including that.
And another question, what is the role of animals in criminology or forensic science? Are there any famous stories of dogs, crime dogs?
Oh, I'm sure there are. Well, they used dogs in the Jack the Ripper case, and they were trying to use these hounds to track down the killer. And that was one of the things that I was like, that if they'd stuck with that may have worked. But the owner of the dogs was concerned that his dogs were in danger by being part of the case. So that was maybe the only dogs I included. Of course, they use larvae, insect larvae, to determine how long a body has been decaying. So that maybe not the animals you're thinking of, but they are animals. Yeah, I wish I had researched more where dogs were helpful in that case. So that may be something you all would like to look into.
You know, it's about 12:30 our time, Bridget, and I think we're about at the end of this. Students, we're going to be joining back together in about 15 minutes to hear Ruta Sepetys. But before we do that, I think we ought to give Bridget Heos a huge round of applause and a thank you for being with us in Youngstown, all the way from Kansas City, and wish you best of luck with your writing, and we hope that we get a chance to connect with you in person.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you all, and thanks for your great questions. It sounds like a lot of you are interested in this, so I hope you'll research it and do some of your own writing if you'd like to.